Welcome to This Explainer. Have you ever noticed how we're constantly swapping out the people in charge, but somehow everything around us just stays exactly the same? Today, we're going to look way past the dramatic headlines and the political theater. We're going to uncover why changing the person at the very top of a government rarely actually changes the reality on the ground. We'll unpack the hidden machinery of modern democracies and explore why the system itself is just far more powerful than the people we elect to run it. Let's kick things off by looking at the absolute carousel of UK prime ministers over the past decade. It's been a rapid-fire rotation of fresh faces. David Cameron, Theresa May, Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, Rishi Sunak. Each time someone new arrives, it's with immense fanfare, right? New slogans, flashy campaign launches, grand promises of national renewal. And then each departure follows just as quickly amidst some new turbulence, scandal, or economic crisis. The speeches change, the logos change, the hashtags change. We get all the excitement of an earthquake and a brand new beginning. But the country itself feels strangely familiar. And here is the really stubborn part. Despite all these dramatic leadership shakeups, the core issues affecting everyday citizens just refuse to budge. The unchanging reality is pretty stark. Taxes remain high, public services are under intense pressure, housing is still incredibly expensive, productivity is sluggish, and infrastructure, it moves at an absolute glacial speed. The names at the top keep changing, but the actual outcomes for everyday people really don't. Sure, governments can make a difference around the margins, but the actual scale of change falls drastically short of that soaring rhetoric we hear during elections. So this brings us to a pretty uncomfortable question, one that kind of challenges our entire view of politics. What if we're blaming the wrong thing entirely? What if Britain's political problem isn't actually the people we're putting into power? What if the problem is the system itself? Because once you start looking beneath the surface, you realize pretty quickly that this isn't just a story about individual prime ministers at all. All right, let's get into Section 1, the official narrative versus the hidden machinery. Now, the official narrative we're fed by the media is wonderfully simple. It goes like this. When things go wrong, it's simply because the wrong person was in charge. It frames politics as this captivating drama full of heroes and villains. The departing leader is the explanation for everything wrong, and the incoming one, well, they're the ultimate solution. And honestly, human beings naturally love this. We're drawn to faces, to kings and captains. But the reality? The real outcomes are actually dictated by complex, unglamorous bureaucracy, entrenched institutions, and hidden incentives. A story about a prime minister's popularity is always going to generate way more clicks than a story about planning regulations, even though those regulations are what truly shape our daily lives. To really understand this hidden machinery, just look at the staggering wall of inherited burdens any new leader faces. Imagine you become prime minister tomorrow. You probably think you have a blank sheet of paper, right? But immediately, you crash headfirst into thousands of existing laws and court rulings, you're met with hundreds of entrenched government agencies and rigidly structured civil service departments. Add to that the heavy external pressures from international treaties, financial markets, and constant media expectations. You aren't starting fresh at all. You are instantly boxed in by decades of established rules. And suddenly you have 14 million people explaining why your reforms are either too radical or just not radical enough. Because of all this, the power of the highest office is honestly a bit of an illusion. Stepping into office is less like steering a nimble little speedboat and way more like trying to redirect a massive oil tanker using a teaspoon. This is just the reality of mature democracies. The system develops enormous inertia. Changing direction becomes extraordinarily difficult. The prime minister might look incredibly powerful on television, but the system itself, it's vastly more powerful. Moving on to Section 2, the psychology of political disappointment. So why do we constantly expect so much from new leaders? Well, the answer lies in something psychologists call the fundamental attribution error. Basically, it's our human tendency to consistently overestimate individual agency and completely underestimate systemic constraints. When things go wrong, we blindly blame the individual, entirely ignoring the deep structures shaping their behavior. Think of it like a football club. Fans almost always blame the manager for a losing streak. But sometimes the club just has awful recruitment, aging players, and deep financial problems that absolutely no manager could realistically solve. Politics operates in the exact same way. We blame the face on the TV, completely missing the massive, rigid structures standing right behind them. And this completely traps us in a vicious, highly predictable cycle. Step 1. The public expects rapid, sweeping transformation from a new leader. Step 2. The system only ever permits incremental change. Step 3. This massive mismatch inevitably leads to deep frustration because people's daily lives aren't actually improving. And finally, step 4, support collapses, the leader is swiftly replaced, expectations magically reset, and the entire feudal loop begins all over again. We are literally trapped in a perpetual cycle of immense political hope followed by inevitable political frustration. Which brings us to Section 3, the hidden system. If you think about it, modern government is essentially like geological sediment. It features thick layers upon layers of rules, committees, and frameworks that have just accumulated over decades. Every single government inherits the decisions of previous governments. Every past crisis created new regulations. Every old scandal spawned new oversight bodies and endless reporting requirements. Eventually, you're left with this massive administrative structure that nobody actually designed as a whole, but that everyone simply inherited and is now forced to navigate. And this creates a really fascinating paradox during elections. To us, the voting public, democratic elections feel like these dramatic revolutions. We see the heated debates, the shifting power dynamics, the triumphant new faces. But for the vast bureaucracy, honestly, they just experience another ordinary Tuesday. Institutional continuity ensures that, behind closed doors, change is incredibly gradual. One group throws a revolution, while the other just grabs a coffee and heads to their 10 a.m. meeting. Let's dive into Section 4, Second-Order Effects, and the Great Paradox. Here is where things get really warped. Because real change takes far too long for the modern media cycle, political incentives shift dramatically. Deep structural problems require careful, long-term solutions, but the system actually rewards short-term announcements and symbolic victories. Narratives become vastly more important than actual implementation. I mean, think about it. A housing reform that takes 10 years to produce results is politically useless to a leader who desperately needs a win today. So the focus shifts away from genuinely solving problems and heavily towards managing perceptions just to score quick, visible headlines. Political communication ends up completely dominating political administration. So every time a new prime minister arrives, priorities shift. Ambitious projects are paused, and sweeping reviews are commissioned. Then, right before those very reforms ever fully mature, another leadership transition occurs, and the whole process just starts from scratch. It's exactly like a gardener constantly uprooting their plants just to check whether they're growing. Eventually, because of this constant nervous interference, absolutely nothing develops properly. Frequent leadership changes actually make genuine, lasting change significantly harder. All right, finally, Section 5, the bigger lesson. So what is the big takeaway from all this constant upheaval? The hard truth is, we absolutely must prioritize systems over charisma. Deep national challenges are institutional problems. They simply cannot be solved by a rousing speech outside Number 10. Housing shortages cannot be solved by charisma. Productivity cannot be improved through clever slogans. Infrastructure cannot be built through press conferences. When journalists and citizens get frustrated, it's natural to search for personalities to blame and new leaders to praise, but doing that completely obscures the deeper reality. Systems matter. Institutions matter. Incentives matter. Ultimately, we really have to stop obsessing over the faces at the top. We need to recognize the vast, quiet machinery that is actively limiting what governments can achieve. Because long after today's headlines disappear and these politicians retire, that machinery will still be humming right along. As the saying goes, replacing the driver does not necessarily change the direction of the road. Which leaves us with one final provocative thought. If the road itself, the system, the institutions, the incentives, is fundamentally flawed, does it really matter who is behind the wheel? Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. Until next time, keep looking past the headlines.